Thank you, and can you all hear me? Yeah. So it's great to be here today, and of course, you left out the most important thing about my biography. I'm from Kerry. Um, so what I want to talk to you today, I'm also, it feels a bit strange to be in a conference where I'm outnumbered by people who are not historians. So I'm really looking at James Barry's life as trans history, and how we can call it that and how we talk about that. Of course, Barry was born in 1789 into a world of defined gender roles, much more so than our world today, and was destined by the contemporary perspectives of his gender at birth to live his life as a woman if he had not done what he did. However, as we heard this morning, I won't go into the histories because you got all that this morning. What I'm more interested in is evaluating Barry's life from using a trans lens and from a trans perspective. He, as everybody knows, entered school in Edinburgh, aged 17, even though they thought he was 12. I was interested to see that this morning, identifying as a man. And what's very interesting about this is the Barry family and supporters had knowledge of what was going on, because there is the story of going to Edinburgh in the carriage with his mother, and it seems in that space, what we would call in feminist studies, I suppose, or gender studies, a liminal space, a space of not being at one fixed position and not yet being at the other fixed position on that journey to Edinburgh. It was a journey both of going to the medical school, but also a journey from who he had been to who he would be, James Barry, the medical student. And of course, he was helped by his uncle, James Barry, the artist. And it's quite peculiar to me that he actually took the name James Barry. You would think to hide identities, he would have taken a different name, because James Barry was very well known, and the relationship between Margaret and James, obviously brother and sister, and also the many people who supported James Barry throughout his life. The earlier ones certainly must have had an inkling as to the gender, the binary or the non-binary gender of James Barry. So from the very beginning, you have this altered history, this different history. It doesn't fit in women's history. It doesn't fit in gender history. It fits in, you could say, non-binary, trans, other types of histories. We're very used to dealing with those if you work in gender studies or in gender history. So it's something that I suppose I want to go through today, and how Barry's life doesn't fit in any one area or one perspective. So the very last mention of his name, when he appears as the name he was known as for the first decade and a half of his life, was a letter written to his solicitor, in which the solicitor wrote Miss Buckley on the envelope, as if reminding himself, as Rebecca Ortenberg says, the solicitor reminding himself that Barry and Buckley were the same person. And so that he would remember that he was talking to this person. And as I said, in that journey, in that carriage, I see it as that space where Margaret is becoming James. I don't like to use what is called in trans speak, the deadening of the person you're talking about, because James Barry chose to live his life as a man, wanted to live his life as a man, and in many ways wanted to live his death and his memory as a man as well, although that was denied him. He never returned to his previous name, never presented as a woman again, except obviously when after death, when the person who was washing him went against his will and took his clothes off. He lived both publicly and privately as a man. And the privately, remember that, because I think that is important as well. Signing his letters as a gentleman and using male pronouns to describe himself. Before going on, there's one thing I will say. Doesn't seem to have been a likable man. He was irascible. He was bossy. I don't think I would have liked him personally. He doesn't seem to have been, that nice, but maybe he was driven both in his private life and in his public life, because he was very driven in terms of his medical career, not just to succeed and climb the ladder, but also to do things. And it wasn't just the Caesarean section, it was about hygiene, it was about cleanliness. And I'll come back to that again with his relationship with Florence Nightingale. He succeeded in achieving his degree at a young age and subsequently enlisted in the army as an assistant surgeon. And you heard all about that this morning. Off he goes then to South Africa, he enters the army and he goes off to South Africa. I hadn't known he was known as a bit of a rake. But I suppose when you look at it like that, he's a very fancy uniform. And it is that time. He is wearing the fashionable clothing of the time, and he looks quite well put up. You can imagine him in Bridgerton, for example, or something like that. One of the first things I think we need to consider in terms of Barry's private life is the relationship with Somerset, whom he met in Cape Town and seems to have become very, very friendly with. There was a lot of scandal around their relationship, but the scandal wasn't because it was an unmarried woman and a married man having a relationship. It was because it was perceived as a homosexual relationship between two men. Certainly was a passionate, intense friendship, could have been platonic, but then again, as somebody who studies sexualities, particularly queer sexualities, I have to ask the question, does it really matter if they did it or not? They had an intense relationship. This was a personal relationship. And certainly it was thought to be true that it was a sexual relationship by their peers at that time. May have been just, facetious or looking at them because they were well-to-do, they were high up in society, so this was gossip. But on June the 1st, 1824, a placard was posted in Cape Town claiming a witness had seen Lord Charles buggering Dr. Barry. How that would have happened, I don't know, but it indicates that people thought they were involved in a homosexual relationship, which of course was much worse than a relationship between a man and a woman if they were not married. That was bad enough, but a homosexual relationship was much worse. Could cause offence and scandal in Cape society, and it ended up actually impacting on Somerset's career. He was moved on from South Africa. So you have to ask yourself, why were both men involved in this intensity of a relationship? It could have impacted on both their careers, and both were very ambitious men. So the intensity of that relationship must have been as such that they were willing to risk their career. Now they do, Barry takes a civil case against people who are saying this about him, again, putting himself in danger. Because what if he had been, questioned on the stand? He would have had to have lied. He would have had to, if he'd been asked to prove himself to be a man, if somebody had even suspected there was something else going on other than a homosexual relationship, he was putting himself really near the point where discovery could have happened, but they did it anyway. So again, we see Barry here living his life as a homosexual man. He's not just a man, he's a gay man. And that's very interesting as well. He was appointed then as Inspector General in charge of the military hospital, and just at one stage he's off in the Crimean War, and he meets Florence Nightingale. Now, I've come across Florence Nightingale before, and I worked on a book written by Frances Taylor, a woman who went out to work with Nightingale and the Irish Sisters of Mercy, many of whom were from Cork, who also went to the Crimea to work in Scutari and various other places, none of whom were impressed with the lady with the lamp at all. He wasn't the only one who found her, particularly around hygiene, that she was lacking in that. And again, you have to ask yourself, it's funny how historical figures gain their legacy or their notoriety. Nightingale was positioned as a lady of the lamp. And so that comes back from the Crimea, and she gets all these accolades and praise, and she's the founder of English nursing. The Sisters of Mercy saved more people in their nursing in the Crimea than Florence Nightingale's hospitals did, because they were able to operate their nursing hospitals away from the military rules and regulations that Nightingale was operating under, which were quite stringent and impacted, but also they were clean. As we all know now, that nuns who ran hospitals in Ireland, the cleanliness was beyond belief in many. Sure, the Bon Secours is just around the corner, various other places like that. Nightingale was upset, or Barry was obsessed with hygiene and not impressed with Nightingale. And he lectured her in the presence of her subordinates. She perceived him as a man, a martinet, horrible, nasty, mean to her, but a man. And she said, he behaved like a brute, the most hardened creature I have ever met. And look at that language. That is not the language of somebody you perceive maybe as non-binary or effeminate or something else. She is perceiving him as a man. We know from our lecture this morning, Barry's skills as a surgeon were excellent. He performed the Caesarean section, although I was very interested to learn from Harriet and from others that there were other Caesarean sections done which were successful earlier on than Barry. So I suppose we could say he was the first in the British Army or British Army surgeon to do it. We need to be a bit more, I suppose, clear in that. He was also dedicated to social reform, speaking out about sanitary conditions and mismanagement of barracks, prisons, and asylums. Very much part of early 19th century culture at that time, where there was beginning a shift towards understanding the conditions in which people were being held in these systems of institutionalization, particularly prisons and asylums. And you begin, for example, to see the first Magdalene asylums, for example, being opened up in Ireland at the time. And institutionalization and committing people to these spaces, carceral spaces, is becoming part and parcel of that 19th century culture that reached its height and flourishes is a wrong word. Flourishes like a horrible weed, I suppose, in the Victorian period, where you then have particularly in Ireland, you have the Magdalene asylums, psychiatric institutions, all sorts of different asylums being set up, particularly for incarcerating women, but also homosexuals. So the reputation of Barry as potentially effeminate, potentially a homosexual is also something I think we need to look at, because it does threaten him. For example, but he continues his work during his 10-year stay in Cape Town. He arranged for a better water system there. Of course, a lot of people died because of dirty water and getting diseases like typhoid and things like that during this period as well. What I want to look at, though, for the rest of the talk is what happens with Barry's body, because the body is the thing that's central to the story of Barry. Really, I want to think about what happens after the body is revealed and what is said and how it continues on in history. Now, there are many Irish-related trans-archival histories, not just Barry. You have Albert Cashier, Edward de Lacy Evans, Patrick McCormack, John Murphy, John Bradley, James Walker, Margaret King, etc., that are also part of Irish trans history. I want to think about for a minute Margaret King. It's very, I think it's an instructive life to measure against Barry. Sarah Phillips at the Irish Trans Archive has made that interesting point. Sarah Phillips is collecting all she can of Irish trans history from the 18th, 19th, 20th century. And she said, what is lost in the story of Dr. Barry is the similarity to the story of another Cork person, Margaret King. Both the King and the Barry families would have moved in similar circles. King attended college in Jena, Germany, to study medicine at a time when women weren't going, which necessitated cross-dressing and turning up to classes as a man. She later studied with a professor of surgery at the University of Pisa and wrote a book of household medicine for the care of babies and children, advice to young mothers on the physical education of children by a grandmother. She had been, in her formative years, a favourite pupil of the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, one of the first feminist books, one of the first feminist demands of equality and rights. However, when King completed her studies in medicine, unlike Dr. Barry, she returns to living as a woman. So there's the difference. Barry never returns to living as a woman. And there was the opportunity. I had a conversation with Sarah about Barry, and Barry could have gone off to America or Canada or places like that, you know, worked in medicine, maybe not as a doctor, but as a wise woman, a herbalist, a midwife, anything like that. And obviously Barry was very interested in the female body. Thesis was written on the female hernia. Imagine defending your PhD in Latin. So there were opportunities for Barry not to live the life he did live and still work in medicine. Differently, and perhaps not at the same level as he did, but he could have been like Florence Nightingale. He could have been like so many other women, or he could have been one of the earliest women doctors if he enforced his way in. And he certainly had the personality, perhaps, to do something like that, because later on in the 19th century, women doctors had to do that. A woman doctor I've written on, Dr. Kathleen Lynn, was only the second generation of women doctors. Myself and Harriet wrote a book with Barry's Kathleen Lynn, and her trials and tribulations of working as a medical doctor, even within a generation that came after the first doctors that blazed that trail. So Barry, with the personality he had, if he wasn't a passing woman, or wasn't anything other than what I'm arguing, a trans man, could have actually lived his life as a man, or a woman. It would have been difficult, but possible. However, he didn't. And in 1859, the 70-year-old Barry returned to England because he was forced to retire by the medical board. He died of dysentery in 1865, and in his documents, as I said, he consistently identified himself as male and uses male pronouns. He left instructions that his body was not to be examined after that. And this is not unusual when you study trans histories. This whole idea, and again, hearing this morning, he didn't like to undress in front of fellow officers. He did not like his body to be uncovered. I wonder then about the relationship with Somerset. Did they ever see each other unclothed? That's another question. Of course, some questions, unfortunately, as a historian, I know you can never get answered. But Barry did not want his naked body to be seen. And that is intent. There's something really strong going on here. Why would you say that? And apparently, if his manservant was away when he died, and had he been there, what happened possibly wouldn't have happened. Again, begs the question, because of course, men of Barry's class and status would have been dressed by their manservants, their valets. We've seen it in Bridgerton and Downton Abbey and all that sort of thing. The valet would have seen the naked body. So you wonder, did Barry have a close relationship with his manservant who kept his secrets? However, he wasn't there when Barry died suddenly, and his last wishes to be buried in his clothes, in which he died without his body being washed, were not adhered to. They were ignored. And consequently, when the nurse undressed the body prepared for burial, she discovered the secret. And now we have Barry back in that carriage again, that space in which he transformed from one identity to another. He's now transforming back into another identity, except the carriage this time is the coffin and into the grave. As Ortenberg writes, 70-year-old Barry said he wanted to be buried in his clothes. Had the request been followed, he would likely be remembered today for his crusading medical work, which is quite impressive. I'm sure you would all agree. Instead, people have spent the last century and a half hypothesizing about his gender. Speculation not on how he lived, but on the nature of his body when he died. So it is that moment when he died and the clothes are taken off, that is the only moment that people seem to hone in on Dr. James Barry. Not the Caesarean section, not cleaning up the water in Cape Town, not having the big fight with Florence Nightingale, all of that, all of the things he achieved and did in his 70-odd years' lives, of which he spent, I'm very bad at maths, 55 in identifying as man. So the majority of it identifying as man. He was buried under the headstone, Dr. James Barry. That has never been changed. And that's very important as well. You know, the people who buried him, the people who got the headstone engraved in Kensal Green Cemetery, which I must visit someday to put a bunch of flowers on the grave and say hello, left it as Dr. James Barry, Inspector General of Hospitals, and that was it. Plain, unaltered, Barry is there. But Barry, after that, becomes something else entirely. And we think about contentious memorialization and disenfranchised grief. This is very much part of trans historical studies. And in the case of detransitioned transgender women and men, which happens after their death, we've heard about that, you know, in recent histories, in the contemporary, when trans men and women might be buried by their families and the obituary would come out under their dead name. And they would be transitioned back to that original, the one their parents wanted or their family wanted. Traditional sources of history, including obituaries, death notices, and grave markers, are altered. Now, in Barry's case, the grave marker doesn't happen, but I argue he is altered. He's altered by what happened when the cleaner, the person who washed him, the nurse, saw his body. These modifications influence the telling of history and silences the voices of transgender men and women who lived and died. Institutions and histories privilege non-transgender persons over individuals who are transgender or gender non-conforming. And people say, well, we can't really call Barry trans because transgender wasn't a thing then. If you're uncomfortable with that, you certainly have to say he was gender non-conforming. However, just because the word trans didn't exist doesn't mean there isn't a trans history here. There are trans histories back into the medieval, back into the early Christian. In Irish, an early Irish Christian folktale is about the Abbot of Drimnagh in Dublin, who fell asleep on a mound as a woman, as a man, and woke up as a woman and lived 9 years as a woman, then and had numerous children, married and had numerous children, then fell asleep on the mound again and woke up as a man. So we have stories that date back, ancient stories that reflect non-binary genders. They are not, they perceive the world as beyond just two binaries, male and female. How his contemporaries responded to the revelations is very interesting as well, because this is when it all starts. The Times Gazette, the Medical Times Gazette, reported on it. And it said, amongst other things, the woman who did the washing said, Dr. Barry was a female, and that I was a pretty doctor. She's writing this letter to Dr. McKinnon not to know this. She then said she'd examined the body and that it was a perfect female, and further the remarks of her having had a child when young. Now, this is where I think it all falls down, because this woman was not a doctor. This woman was brought in to wash the body. She may have seen stretch marks, but I mean, you get stretch marks for all sorts of reasons, not just giving birth. I've never given birth, and I have a few of them, I can tell you. And so what she's looking for is money. She's looking to blackmail. And the woman seemed to think that she had become acquainted with a great secret. And that's a very interesting statement, that she had become acquainted with a great secret, implying that the secret was known to maybe Barry's intimate circle of friends. Certainly, I would argue it was known to his manservant, to his valet. It was known to when he was younger, when he went off to Edinburgh, to those who supported him. It's obvious it must have been known to them. So this secret was held for many, many years by at least one, if not more people. And this implies that Dr. McKinnon knew and wished to be paid for keeping it. I informed her that all of Dr. Barry's relatives were dead and it was no secret of mine, and that my impression was that Dr. Barry was a hermaphrodite. So again, there was an acknowledgement here that there was something not quite normative about Dr. Barry's death or body, and that was no problem. This is a defined thing, a hermaphrodite. We know about those. We know from Greek mythology about, that's where it comes from, the whole idea of the hermaphrodite. How did his contemporaries respond? Well, Edward Bradford said, the stories that have circulated about him since his death are too absurd to be gravely disputed. There's no doubt among those who knew him that his real physical condition was that of a male in whom sexual development had been arrested about the 6th month of fetal life. And again, this is the whole hermaphrodite idea, that he was a man with a condition. And something happened in utero, and but Dr. Barry was James Barry. However, lives like James Barry continue to exercise argument, debate, who and what they were. They are very fascinating precisely because they reveal ways in which trans and gender non-conforming people navigated, embodied, and survived gender across historical and cultural contexts. So there are people who knew Barry was not as male as he was outwardly facing to be, but it didn't matter. So doing trans history involves work and hard conversation. It means upending, as Jack Doyle says, entrenched practices in academia and public history. Means prioritizing trans people, regardless of their proximity to the academy, who have dedicated themselves to exploring, improving, and documenting trans lives. People still misgender Dr. Barry all the time. The latest work that I could find was 2019, The Cape Doctor. The author insisted on calling Dr. Barry she. Shifting readings, she said, of her body, Barry's body, or what my novel wrestles with, it's been taken into account. I use she, her as her biographers do. And the early biographers did. They did grapple with the body, but they came, it was, you know, Dr. Barry was a passing woman, but very different history here than passing women. In response, writer Alexander Ern tweeted, he categorized himself as a man, lived as a man, died as a man, and would have been preferred to take that last journey in the coffin into the grave as a man. There is no room for interpretation here. As I said myself in an interview, Barry's life story challenges our understanding of the past and should not be looked at simply through the lens of masculine, feminine, heteronormative binary. By not heeding Barry's own desires and words, by misgendering him, by focusing only on his genitals. And that seems to be in the entire focus of people's looking at Barry, and not the way he lived his life and all the things he did, and the relationship with Somerset and all of that. We do a disservice to Barry. I think the last word can go to Ortenberg. For his entire life, James Barry gave no indication he was anything other than a man. Let's take him at his word. Thank you very much.